Welcome back. So let's switch gear to talk about Chinese identity in the age of globalization. I'm going to focus on one very recent discourse called the Chinese Dream, or 中国梦. The so-called Chinese Dream was kind of constructed earlier this year, in March. So this is it's kind of a still evolving discourse. Just to preface it, I think I should mention that the rise of China, that's another kind of a more general topic, is something we are more familiar with. Along with that, the discourse on how to contain China, how to try to avoid a war between the sitting power, namely here, and the rising power. If China is going to repeat the experience of Germany after the First World War, namely heading toward a head collision with the West, by declaring that it pursues its own unique way, the particular way, the German discourse of a Sonderweg. The Germans have their own particular path of development, different from the West, the French, the English, the American, decadent or individualistic, whereas the Germans honor collectivity or that sort of thing, state tradition. All these concerns and worries are part of the context. I'm not going to talk about the security issues, the trade issues, all these more concrete material things. I'm going to concentrate on one particular, sort of more philosophical issue called the universal and the particular. So it sounds very abstract, but by that I mean to translate the set of questions we just mentioned into the binary opposite or the dialectical unity, the contradiction between the universal and the particular. Is China going to be one particular society or culture or civilization or country or ethnicity? The list goes on. Or it's going to participate in a more common universal culture, even contributing to the redefinition, the development of that inclusive common culture of the world. This is actually a very, very complicated issue. The complexity stems partly from, as the first set of questions suggest, whether this world, with its existing order, the world order, right, with its own history, concretely put, the post-war, Second World War, what we call Pax Americana, this American design that dominated world peace. It's an institution. It has its particular setups and the rules and the principles, all backed by real power and the concrete history, how Americans fought the war, defeated Germany and Japan, and represented more than 50% of the world's total output, universal currency, hard currency. All these things we know are diminishing. If not in absolute terms, definitely in terms of percentage. Right? Now, U.S. economy is less than a quarter of that of the world, probably 22%, and still declining. And the Chinese figure, the East Asian figure, all these are rising. So that constitutes a whole set of problems. But the problems is also contributed by the Chinese self-understanding, the self-perception. And probably by virtue of discussing the issue of Chinese dream, I'm slightly concentrating on the Chinese self-understanding and to see what kind of problems or promises or challenges are there. To begin with, I think the Chinese dream is I guess this is not a surprise, a copy of an existing dream, which is the American dream. Yeah. Would it be a good thing if the Chinese dreamed the American dream? In a way, the world will be a more peaceful, predictable place if the Chinese dream is the American dream. Namely, the Chinese, while dreaming their own Chinese dreams, are actually dreaming the American dream. Land of opportunity, freedom, upward mobility, choice, right? Openness, and so on and so forth. But then, first, American dream is indeed a universal dream. It's all inclusive in theory, but in actuality, it's conditioned by a lot of circumstances that are not to be repeated. Others are not going to discover the new world and then have this landmass to conquer and slavery as part of the primitive accumulation, or 2 world wars, this unique combination of European modernity and its larger scale development in the New World. Like a German sociologist Max Weber has observed, of all major human civilizations or nations, America is the only big country born in modernity. It doesn't have its share in pre-industrial history. It is born in the modern world. It defines the modern. If the Chinese are going to collectively declare, here we come, we're the newcomers to the American dream, not everybody is going to like it. Probably you should we all know this example. What if the China, by the way, is already the largest automaker in the world. I don't know whether you know this, the students sitting in the back. China's auto production figure is that the combined figures of Japan and America. Yeah. In terms of production of steel, it's 75% of the world figure. It's 3/4 of steel is produced in China. But still, this is the flip side. In terms of per capita accumulated steel consumption, America is like every American is backed by 10 tons of steel, historically accumulated. Yeah. The Chinese figure is approaching to 5 tons. It's only half of the US figure, but rapidly developing. Yeah. So if every single Chinese, on average, consumes the same amount of energy, raw materials, food, well, we will have to do something rather systematic about our environment, maybe conquer another planet or something. So it poses a challenge. It's just a very, this is the dinner table conversation in China, among urban middle class families. They do talk about these things. What kind of society we're going to build? Is the American model our model? In other words, even if the Chinese want to dream the American dream, there will be rude awakenings. They will wake up with nightmares or with doubts, with cold sweat. They will have to think twice. So in the most benign, constructive sense, the Chinese will have to modify their own dreams. So, okay, politically, maybe in terms of freedom, human rights, in these human ideals, we might share a lot with the American dream. For the time being, let's all bracket the problems of American dreams. We are not going in that direction at all today. I don't want to sound like unprincipled apologist for American dream, because my colleagues back home will jump on me. That's a bad joke. I will take that back. it's only focused on how Chinese will be compelled to revise, modify their their willingness to jump on board this American dream. Then there's this issue, as I mentioned earlier, very briefly, this access issue. Whether the Chinese will be allowed, permitted, or denied access, that's an open question. There's no guarantee that the Chinese will be, China, the country, the people, the system, the institution will be welcomed into this club, with open arms. And conflict, friction, competition, rivalry, all that would, they're just part of the equation. There's no way to pretend that they don't exist. The second step, if you are to revise and modify this American dream in order to define it as your dream, to appropriate the American dream as your own dream, then the natural, logical question would be, to what extent? Sooner or later, there's this tipping point. It's a philosophical question. The quantitative change will eventually bring qualitative change, right? It's like water. If you heat it up, it's just a matter of temperature rising. All of a sudden, the tipping point is reached. It evaporates, liquid becomes vapor, or it becomes ice. So there's a kind of a moment of qualitative change. And that tipping point, that decisive moment, is theoretically there, if not realistically there. And that is when the Chinese intellectuals, politicians, entrepreneurs, the creative people all decide, actually, the Chinese dream is so qualitatively different from the American dream. It's time for us to start formulating this thing called the Chinese dream. But if you have two dreams in the world, well, there's competition, there's rivalry, not military rivalry, not industrial, commercial rivalry. It's the competition of ideals, of dreams. We have a world politics of dreams. Dreaming is not something innocent or purely psychoanalytical. You wake up and they say, I want to see my shrink about why I dream of this. No, it's about the image after which you create and recreate yourself, right? And once this possibility is opened, then of course, different scholars following different disciplinary lines would start working on it. It cannot be stopped or reversed. Those who work on religion, history, culture, would say, well, at least you should consider the difference between Christianity and this Chinese world dominated by Confucianism, Taoism. Is it a secular world, an atheist world, or and so on and so forth. Religion is a very, very important point. The old-fashioned kind of environmental sort of restraints, material conditions of possibility, these will be considered and reconsidered. But now let me refer to the most recent state discourse of Chinese dream. It's kind of proposed by the new Chinese president Xi Jinping in last March in the following way. So the Chinese dream is the ideal shared by all the people in China. It's about the historic revival of Chinese civilization. So China used to be a glorious civilization. It was kept down by Western powers. Now it's on course, marching toward its inevitable revival. Well, in a way, it's natural. Even the mainstream economists always say, well, there's nothing to be surprising about the Chinese, the rise of China, because historically, its GDP figure is always like somewhere between a quarter to a third of the entire world population. So in a way, we should be prepared for this China assuming its own historical position. Nothing, But in a different, in other senses, this could be ominous, this could be extremely stressful. You are basically, the worst scenario, worst case scenario would be this understanding of the world as a so-called zero-sum game. If you take more, I'll have to yield room to you. You know, it's like a new guy boarding the bus, so someone will have to make room to accommodate this guy. And what if this guy is a 100-pound gorilla? You know, that's the kind of a. So it's already very complicated. But the second point the Chinese president mentioned is more interesting. Is that you could say the Chinese dream is forward-looking, you know, about revival, right? But revival already points to the past. The Chinese dream, in terms of its historical moral substance, should be determined by a collective memory of the commitment, the struggle, the ideals of our fathers and grandfathers throughout the history of modern China, if not earlier. Namely, this is a crucial point I want to focus on. That is, the ideal would not be to this is the crucial point at which the proposed discourse of Chinese dream gets separated from American dream. Because if you look at your own history, how you have arrived here, then histories are very, very different. The modern Chinese history is a history characterized by this traumatic entry into the world system, humiliation at the hands of Western powers, semi-colonization, just general weakness. You know. And that to overcome that, there's always this is extremely reductive, but let's just mention two lines of thinking. One is that actually this, as a discourse, it goes back to ancient Chinese history when the Emperor Qin, who unified China, toured the country, you know, as the hegemon. The rebel leaders, the eventual rebel leaders who toppled his regime, actually stood in the crowd watching. This is in the record of grand historian Shi Ji. Xiang Yu, this hegemon, this kind of a warrior, says that guy can be replaced, namely by me. You know. The future emperor of Han Dynasty, Liu Bang, said, a real man should be like that. So these are two ways of unseating the sitting power, right? One is I want to take his place. That would be one more simplistic way of thinking. For China to overcome its humiliating past, to embrace its future glory, we should be the next America, more American than America. Yeah. We keep pushing until we are stopped. We should expand our sphere of freedom as much as we can. The other line is the kind of a subtle, slightly more subtle line would be something like this. And that is rooted in a long intellectual history of learning from the West. As a devoted student of modern Western civilization, but with this painful recognition that that our teachers have done something terribly wrong. And again, a reductive version is this. This formerly proposed by Yan Fu, who was the first Chinese translator of Darwin's Evolution and Ethics, Huxley's Evolution of Ethics, the first introducer of the theory of evolution to China, which inspired the whole Chinese civilization. See, the modern Chinese history was like intellectually was one of the sources of inspirations, definitive sources of inspiration is the theory of evolution. And by extension, social Darwinian kind of belief about competition and survival of the fittest. But it's Yan Fu who said this. He said, there's no doubt Britain, France, Germany or Prussia, America, these are civilized nations. We should learn from them. They set the example. But the world created after their image, based on their principles, freedom, law, prosperity, progress, is such a savage world. We as Chinese feel it. You have to compete so ruthlessly. You have to condemn yourself and your fellow countrymen to the jungle in order to survive. Survival as what? As new barbarians armed with machines, with technology, with this ruthless idea of competition, of winner takes all, or as underdogs, as latecomers, while we try to save ourselves from annihilation, right? We should try to come up with a better idea. We should learn from our masters and teachers, and then, and in the meanwhile, we should reprogram certain aspect of it, so that new China, or the Chinese as a new sort of a species, fit for survival in this world, will not carry on the same old ideas, which put us in this situation. And presumably there are others. So there were, at Yan Fu's time, Lu Xun was one of them. The translation of foreign literature was concentrated on those small, manipulated, suppressed nations, from the Philippines to Poland to Scandinavian countries. That was a very interesting phenomenon. Not the translation of powerhouses in Western Europe, North America, but of these small, abused countries. That indicates a certain sympathy with the underdogs. And by implication, the underdogs, while they fight for their own kind of a new status, should not simply repeat the logic. That's Xiang Yu's logic. I will have the hegemon, sitting hegemon replaced. I want to be on top. But rather, there should be a new definition of civilization. What's civilized mean? So this is the kind of I think the core issue of the Chinese dream. But now, because this discourse is so new, there's very little substance to this kind of it's a nice thought philosophically. Oh, let's search for a more universal idea, right? Called the Chinese dream. But in what ways this could be more universal? Because it immediately was it's met with a lot of media and the public cynicism. And I always mention this one particular comment, because in China you can post a comment online, and I read them. And one is said, what's the fuss about Chinese dream? If there's such thing called Chinese dream, the only difference from the American dream is the one defined by time difference, where when American dreams, we are daydreaming. So that basically, it's kind of a frustration. There's a new round of government propaganda. You should first solve the problem of the housing bubbles, all these demolition, unequal distribution of wealth, rampant corruption, and all these things before you talk about these grand ideas. First, we could approach the level of, say, civilization in America, we'll be very happy already. So that's kind of a understandable popular reluctance to buy this kind of a official discourse. But I think there is a historic moment, opportunity, which should not be dismissed so readily, because it is a rare and potentially poignant moment for us at least to think about this thing called the universal. By using the American dream as the common frame of reference, and then try and search for possible new substance, historical, social, economic, and political, either as a supplement or as it's a rare opportunity for an emergent society to contribute to something, not only about itself, but about something more. I have to stop very in a minute. I want to mention only one thing having to do with the substance of this Chinese dream. I think it would have to come from the realm of production, of material production and social production. I mentioned the sweatshops in China when we talked about Mo Yan. Nowadays, even though China is doing extremely well economically, its particular labor, let's say, value-added sort of a production of Chinese labor is still defined at a very low end. So relatively poorly trained, definitely poorly paid, a lot of pollution, without all these necessary social political rights. That the Chinese labor force, if it forms the new sort of at the bottom, I would call it, I'm tempted to call it the fourth estate, as opposed to the third estate. We, the middle class, historically come from the third estate, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the Bastille, all that. But once the third estate, the bourgeoisie, the middle class, becomes such a dominant mainstream political power and amassed all these wealth, if it becomes a hardened shell, ossified kind of a power relationship, then it sets up for a world historical challenge. I don't want to sound apocalyptic, but the laborers in China, India, maybe to a less degree in Brazil, in South Africa, in Russia, in all these developing areas, face this historical, are at a historical crossroads. They could be condemned, three actually, they could be condemned to this low-end, labor-intensive producer, this status forever. Nobody actually wants this to be prolonged. It's not even good for American working class. We know that. The second is somehow miraculously they climb on top through education, through training, like the German workers, Japanese workers, Singaporean workers. Somehow they make it. But this making it seems no more a repetition of the success stories. If while they make it sort of they succeed economically without changing the value system, without coming up with a new culture, a new social system, it has nothing to contribute to the discourse of dreams or values. So now the third option is the most utopian, you could say almost most wishful kind of a discourse would be for this, the fourth estate, the new labor force to come with a new culture, a new value system. And that currently in China, a number of things point to the possibility, remote or otherwise possibilities of for that. One is this pre-industrial, pre-bourgeois forms of life, customs, memories, culture, value systems, from filial piety to Confucian values, meritocracy, to a more modern, namely revolutionary age legacies like equality, like self-sacrifice, state tradition. That they seem to exist or function as a kind of what I call chamber of resonance. Those kind of ideas could wash around inside this relatively secured space. Whereas when it comes to this point, there is a big difference between big countries and small countries. In a small country, especially if that country is too close to the power centers of the West, it's easily get overwhelmed, washed away. It cannot withstand the pressure, the influence from these, metropolitan centers. But in places like China, there is a possibility for this kind of a social lab for ideas and different modes of production, social systems, all these experiments to flourish. And that China, unlike all these stereotypes, is not monolithic. It's not a uniform entity. In every aspect of society, of economy, of culture, China is a huge mosaic. It's like consisting of hundreds, if not thousands of pieces. There is a social experiment in Guangdong, which is very different from social experiments in Jilin. The so-called Deng's reform began that way, starting from a very, very small local experiments and gradually expand. And there are different competing models. The Jiangnan model, the Sunan, southern Suzhou model versus the Chongqing model, and so on and so forth. So there is this possibility in that regard. But most importantly, I think it's the nominally communist state. As long as it's a functional, reasonably meritocratic state, acting as the guarantor of socioeconomic development, could nourish these local experiments, these diverse cultural value systems. There is a chance for the new Chinese labor force to gradually find and formulate their own value system based on their own productivity and the organization of labor and the social political participation. So I apologize for all these relatively abstract talks, but I think the talk about Chinese identity should not be limited to a sheer matter of ethnic, racial, national conflict, but deep down, it's really about labor forces, the working people, in a constructive way, the competition for some kind of a new value, a new culture. This, of course, has to do with China, at least the Chinese cultural elite's self-understanding of as a universal culture. Chinese, the educated class in China, historically or now, never ever considered China just another country. This may sound bad, or what else are you? But by that I mean that China is, this nation historically is defined in terms of civilization. There was no such thing as Chinese national border in all these dynastic centuries or a millennium. You just walk north. Gradually, you see the landscape is different. People dress differently, treat their parents differently. This is the end of China. But then so then it's always defined culturally, civilizationally, which means, in theory, it's always open. You could be a Chinese as long as you subscribe to this, this cultural, civilizational system, and vice versa. It's not a typical modern nation state in that sense. So that also, for better or for worse, leaves a kind of opens this possibility for this discourse of the Chinese stream as part of a kind of inclusive discussion on a universal culture to come. Okay.